In May of 2008, Scott Johnson and Sean Farmer went for a fishing and camping trip in Dismal Creek, Virginia, just off of the Appalachian Trail. They were regulars at this spot and probably didn't think that this trip would be any different than all the ones before. However, they would soon realize that this would not be the case. They befriended a man named Ricky Williams, who ended up joining them at their campsite for dinner. Everything seemed to be going fine, but then all of a sudden, this man opened fire on both of them. And eventually the two men would learn that their attempted killer was not actually named Ricky Williams, but rather he was Randall Lee Smith. And this was not his first time attempting to kill along the Appalachian Trail. This is the story of the most dangerous man in Appalachian Trail history. Randall Lee Smith spent almost his entire life in the town of Pearisburg, Virginia, which is right along the Appalachian Trail. Most towns along the Appalachian Trail are far enough away from the trail that you have to get a ride into town, hitchhike, something like that. But Pearisburg is kind of an exception. It's so close to where the trail crosses through there that you can actually walk right from the trail into the center of town. And I actually did this in 2018 when I hiked the Appalachian Trail. Randall Lee Smith grew up with the Appalachian Trail essentially being right in his backyard. There isn't too much known about Smith's upbringing, but we do know two things with certainty. The first thing is that Smith was a habitual liar, and he even got the nickname Lion Randall. And the second thing is that not only did Randall Lee Smith just happen to live near the Appalachian Trail, but he spent a lot of time just wandering around on it in the areas near his hometown. He would eventually go on to become very well known within the Appalachian Trail community, and for all the wrong reasons. In the spring of 1981, a social worker from Maine named Robert Mountford Jr. decided to take on a through hike of the AT. By the time he got to Virginia, he was joined by his friend Susan Ramsey, who was planning on hiking with him for a few weeks. The pair had told another hiker that they were going to meet her in Pearisburg, Virginia, but that date rolled around and Mountford and Ramsey never showed up. Eventually, the authorities were contacted and they began searching along the Appalachian Trail. Investigators went to a store along the AT called Trent's, and they were asking if anyone had seen the two missing hikers. And as it turns out, they actually had been spotted there on May 19th, 1981, which would end up being one of their last known sightings. The investigators also received some reports that Mountford and Ramsey had been seen near a particular shelter along the Appalachian Trail, and they were accompanied by an unknown man who had been acting eerie. This shelter was the Wapiti Shelter. 11 days after the last sighting of Mountford and Ramsey, investigators zeroed in on Wapiti Shelter. At first glance, everything at the shelter looked normal, but once a closer look was taken, blood was noticed between the floorboards of the shelter. That was not a good sign, and so with this in mind, investigators started searching the area, the woods surrounding the shelter, and it wasn't long before they discovered a very unnatural looking mound of leaves on the ground. It looked like something had been intentionally buried there. It looked like someone had been digging and tried to cover something up. The investigators then began digging, and they quickly discovered a buried cloth sleeping bag, and inside of it was the body of Susan Ramsey. The investigation continued the next day, and it didn't take long before search dogs discovered the area where Robert Mountford Jr. was also buried, again, also in his sleeping bag. An autopsy later revealed that he had been shot. Susan Ramsey had not been shot, however. She met her very, very tragic end due to stab wounds, and they also found defensive marks on her hands, indicating that she fought her attacker hard. As investigators searched the scene for more clues, they eventually discovered Ramsey's discarded backpack. And inside her backpack, they found a paperback book. And this would prove to be a huge break in the case. The book contains some bloody fingerprints, and one of the fingerprints belonged to the killer. The fingerprint was traced to Randall Lee Smith, who had prints on file from his time working in the Norfolk, Virginia shipyards. And upon searching his home, investigators discovered several items that belonged to the two murdered hikers, including a bloody pair of jeans. At this point, they still hadn't apprehended Randall Lee Smith, but they did eventually track him down all the way in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where he was arrested. Smith refused to talk to investigators about what had happened, and eventually a date for his trial was set. However, the night before his trial was set to begin, the prosecutor accepted a plea bargain from Randall Lee Smith's attorneys. Smith pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to, are you ready for it? 30 years in prison. Now, 30 years is a lot, obviously, but if I could just interject my opinion a little bit here, I think it's absolutely crazy that someone gets anything less than life in prison without the possibility of parole for a double homicide. That's crazy to me. And I'm not the only one that feels this way, because at the time, back when this plea bargain was made public, a bunch of people went and actually protested at the courthouse, including a lot of hikers. And one of these hikers was Warren Doyle Jr., who's a very well-known person within the Appalachian Trail community, and he's actually hiked the Appalachian Trail 18 times. Now, as for the reasons that Smith got such a light sentence for such a heinous crime, it's really not super clear. I did find some reports that said the prosecutor at the time was worried about the case being strong because they never really discovered a motive for the crime, and therefore I guess they just felt like they had to take this plea deal because it was too risky to go to trial, but I don't know. While in prison, Randall Lee Smith was reportedly a model inmate. He caused no issues, and he was released on parole in 1996, having served only half of his sentence. Again, is charged with second-degree murder, a double homicide, and he gets out of prison in 15 years. At the time of Smith's release, Warren Doyle Jr. was quoted in the Roanoke Times saying, "If another incident happens with Randall Smith, perhaps the people who are responsible for the plea bargain should be put on trial." And I think that quote is a very, very chilling foreshadow of what was to come next. After being paroled in 1996, Smith returned to his home in Parisburg, Virginia, and he kept a pretty low profile. However, he did continue to live up to his nickname, Lion Randall, because one of his neighbors was quoted saying, he, referring to Smith, said that he now had a girlfriend in Daytona Beach. He said he went down there to see her. It was a lie. Also, he said that he had a house in Daytona Beach and one in Las Vegas. Obviously, a bunch of nonsense for a man who just spent the last 15 years in prison and is currently on parole with an ankle monitor. Overall, for the next 12 years, Randall Lee Smith stayed out of trouble, and it seemed like finally people's fears about him committing another violent act on the AT were starting to be put to rest. That all changed in May of 2008. Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer went on a fishing and camping trip in Dismal Creek, Virginia. This area is very close to the Appalachian Trail. As you can see here, it's just mere feet away from where the trail runs through in many spots. While the two men were fishing, they actually encountered another man named Ricky Williams and his dog. This Ricky Williams character was described as being sort of straggly looking, and the men also believed that he might have been an alcoholic. But despite this unsettling appearance, Johnston and Farmer were good dudes, and so they invited this Ricky Williams man back to their campsite to have dinner. And everything seemed to be going okay, but then as nighttime was starting to set in, Ricky Williams randomly stood up, called to his dog, and then started walking away from the campsite. And then the actions that this man took would forever change the lives of Johnston and Farmer. Ricky Williams pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and shot Farmer. The attack came out of absolutely nowhere. Ricky Williams then turned the gun on Johnston and shot him twice as he attempted to flee into some nearby brush to take some cover. Eventually, Johnston stopped to catch his breath, and when he turned around, he saw the man shoot his friend Farmer again. Farmer desperately started running towards his Jeep and somehow managed to take off and drive away before Ricky Williams could get a hold of him. Johnston took off down the road, and eventually he was actually intercepted by Farmer, who had fled in the opposite direction. Johnston stopped the Jeep, and Farmer quickly hopped in, and they kept going down the road. Now keep in mind, they're in the middle of the woods. This is a very remote road, and they are miles and miles away from any sort of civilization. And they were also in critical condition. They had both just been shot, and Farmer actually began to lose sight in one of his eyes. So Johnston took over the steering, and Farmer remained operating the gas and brake pedals. Miraculously, they managed to make it down the road, and when they saw a house on the side of the street, they went and pleaded with the homeowner to help them and to call the police. The police and paramedics did eventually arrive, and the two men were flown to the nearest hospital in critical condition. And thankfully, by some sort of miracle, both men survived the attack. And the next day, when the police interviewed Sean Farmer, he was told that the man who attacked him was not actually named Ricky Williams, but rather he was Randall Lee Smith. And this man had attempted and unfortunately succeeded to kill along the Appalachian Trail in the past. In fact, the location of Smith's 1981 murders were less than 2 miles away from the location of his 2008 attacks. And it turns out that after Johnston and Smith had made their escape in the Jeep, Smith then fled police by stealing Johnston's truck, and during the pursuit, he actually crashed the truck, and he crashed it hard. He crashed it so hard that police thought it might have actually been an attempted suicide. But it wasn't, and Smith was captured and taken into custody. And then, 4 days later, he died. Finally, the most dangerous man in Appalachian Trail history was no longer a threat. When police searched the area of Smith's 2008 attack, they found a cache containing an assortment of very random and creepy items. They found his GED and birth certificates, a police scanner, and they even found a map of the area with several places marked with X's on it. And so, of course, they searched those areas, fearing the worst, but they never found anything in those locations that was suspicious. In this cache, they also found a cassette tape that contained, quote, some kind of satanic ritual. They found 8 pairs of women's underwear and over 30 knives. So unfortunately, violent attacks like this do occur on the Appalachian Trail, but I would be remiss if I didn't make it crystal clear that these sorts of attacks are very, very, very rare. Every single year, millions of people set foot on the Appalachian Trail with no incidences, no violence, nothing happening. I hiked the entire Appalachian Trail in 2018, and I didn't have any problems, and this is the case for the vast majority of people. These stories are real, they are scary, and I just hope that it serves as a reminder to you to just be alert and aware and keep your wits about you when you're hiking. And I also want to remind you that you are infinitely more likely to have a violent, dangerous encounter walking down the street in pretty much any city in the world than when you are walking on the Appalachian Trail. Just a few days ago, I finally hit my goal of 50,000 subscribers, so thank you so much to everybody who subscribed to the channel. And once we hit a goal like this, we can't just stop. No, we need a new goal. It's probably 100,000. Should I go a little bit less first? Should I do like 70,000 just to do increments? I don't know. Leave a comment whether my next goal should be 70,000 or if I should just say screw it and go right for 100,000. I don't know. Either way, thank you guys so much for all the support you've shown this channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what the next goal is, but please help me get there.